Now, my name is Tunde, and today I'll be walking over some of the options that we have when we are trying to set up a Kubernetes master node with worker nodes using Kubeadm. So we are trying to configure a Kubernetes cluster using Kubeadm. What are some of the options that we have, and what does those options, what do they mean? So now, before we can actually go through this tutorial or this discussion, let's do a walkthrough of some of the options that you have when you try to run Kubeadm init. As you can see, you have the option of specifying the API server advertiser address and the API server bind port. Now, what does this option, what do they mean, and how can you put your own, how can you customize them? Now, I'm going to do a walkthrough. Now, if you look at my configuration right here, it simply says kube init. The API server advertiser address is 172.31.17.94, right? That is the private IP address of this particular node, and I want the API server to listen on that IP address, right? So if anybody wants to talk to it, it listens on that address and also advertise that it's actually listening on that particular IP or that particular interface, if you may. Now, that's what the API advertise address simply means. It means how do you want people to talk to you. Now, API server bind port simply means the port on which they can use to talk to you. Now, most time in Kubernetes, I'm very sure most of us have come across 6443. That's the default one. That's the default port if you do not specify something custom that you want to use, right? Now, let's move on to the API SAT extra subject alternative name. What does that mean? Now, if I try to connect to my API server, right, listening on this particular, advertising this particular IP address, right, everything should go well as planned. But now, let's say I create a Route 53 record in AWS and point this particular domain, master.mydomain.net, to this IP address. You would expect that everything should go well as planned, but you will realize something. You are going to run into certificate error. How do you fix this certificate error? The reason why you are getting one is because the way you're trying to talk to the Kubernetes to the master node, right, is not one of the valid subject alternative name that was specified when you were starting your Kubernetes cluster. So what you need to do is, in that case, when you're setting up your Kubernetes cluster, you need to make sure that the master.mydomain.net is one of the extra. That means one of the other way of talking to the master, the API server rather. So one of the other way of talking. So therefore, when the certificate is being generated, a certificate is going to be generated that is valid for this IP address and also valid for this domain. So anytime a kubectl tries to interact with your cluster, it doesn't get a certificate issue, right? Now, let's talk about the future gate. What does the future gate mean? We have certain features that we want, they are not enabled by default, but they are still in experimental phase, whether it's beta, whether it's alpha, right? Now, let's say you want to like just mess around and just try this feature. For example, dynamic kubelet config, right? So this is a future gate that is still in beta right now. So if you want to use it, you simply set it to be true. So that feature gate is going to be enabled. Now, the next thing you're going to do is configure the Kubernetes version. The Kubernetes version, it's very simple. What version are you trying to run? Now, one other thing that is kept is the CRI socket. The CRI socket simply means think of the socket as a way for the kubelet to talk to your container runtime. In most cases, your container runtime is going to be Docker. How is it going to talk to Docker? Tell it to create a port, to create container rather. Get health check on container. Talk to the Docker runtime. It talks to the CRI socket. Excuse me. Now, the next thing that we need to do is, I'm going to skip this option for now, config. I will come back to this. The next thing is ignore pre-flight errors. Ignore pre-flight errors. What it means that Kubeadm always do what we call some pre-checks. So it tries to check your environment and make sure some things that are necessary to configure your master node are in place. For example, one of the things that is in place is the host name of this particular node must be resolvable. Right. Now the other thing that must be in place is that the swap must be off. Right. Another thing that must be in place is that certain programs have to be in your executable path. That means some certain program has to be installed on your system, right? Now, one thing that needs to be placed is it checks if your Docker, right? If you are using Docker as your container runtime, it's going to check if Docker is actually running. Now, one other thing that it's going to check is it's going to check if you have programs like firewall D that, right, it checks if those programs are running, and if they are running, it's kind of what it throws an error. Now, one other thing that it checks is, now it tries to make sure that anytime it is starting the master node, certain ports need to be available. One of those ports is what? 10.250, 10.251, 10.252. Those are bind ports for the API servers. Those ports need to be available. So it checks those ports. Those are some of the checks that happen. What we call them the pre-flight checks. So if you specify ignore those pre-flight checks error, that means there's a violation of the check, but you want to ignore it. You're good to go, provided you know what you're doing. Now the next thing is the network CIDR. What IP range? Think of it as what IP range do you want to be given to your port, and this value depends on which, as you can see here, it actually depends on what the kind of how do I say this, the network plugin that you're using. So I'm going to come back to this sometimes later in this tutorial. Then we have the service CIDR. You should be able to predict right now what IP ranges do you want to be given to your services. Very, very easy. Now, the service DNS domain. For those who have worked Kubernetes cluster, you will realize that most of the time, your service DNS name always ends in cluster.local. Right? If you want to change that, this gives you opportunity to change that. Now, token. Skip token print. What is a token? A token is what allows your node, your node to join the master, for them to join the master, right? So that token is needed for validation, right? So if you run kube init command, this one, the token is going to be printed on the outside. If you don't want that, you simply pass in this option. Now the token, sometimes, most of the time, the token get generated for you and get outputted into your console. Now if you want to specify your own token, something you already know, and a pre-existing value, this is how you do that. And your token must follow a certain format, which is it must be the first 6 must be alphanumeric, no capital, and .16, the same thing, alphanumeric, no capital. Now the next thing is how long that token is going to be valid for. Now these are some of the options that when you are when you're trying to set up Kubeadm, you will be able to configure. Now in the next tutorial, I'm going to walk you through how you can actually configure Kubeadm from a configuration file. I'm probably going to post this as a blog post, and hopefully I'm able to share this knowledge, something useful to someone. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.